Welcome everybody to the Click podcast, where you get your daily dose of DAO deep dives and DAO insights. This is a place where we want to get into the heart of what makes a DAO tick and also get into the minds of these DAO operators beyond just abstract ideas. We feel that DAOs are the frontier of coordination, and it is also necessary to get into the heart of all these DAOs to understand the next generation of work and everything. And we have with us one of the OGs of the DAO space, someone who's been working and trying to actively shape the whole concepts of what we understand to be DAOs. We have Daniel Ospina, who was formerly the head of governance at Aragon and is now at the frontier with a new DAO called RnDAO, as well as he's also a member of the Aragon executive sub DAO. Welcome, Daniel, to the podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm quite good. It's Friday afternoon in Berlin, where I'm staying at the moment. Very much looking forward for a nice weekend after a long week. And this is my last meeting. So quite enjoying having a conversation as a way to transition.
Oh, that's fantastic. And that too in a place like Berlin, ending a day with a podcast convo. Kind of grateful to have you on board, man. And my name is Abhishek Ajit, and I have with me my co-host. Hi, Abhishek. What's up?
Hey, everyone. Hi, man. I'm doing good.
Awesome. So let's just kickstart things. Daniel, we have the proverbial question, what's your story? That kind of begins every podcast. But now I want to tweak that also to something different here. Although we want to know about your story for our listeners. More importantly, what I wanted to ask was, what were the experiences in your life that made you connect with the concept of DAOs? I know that I've listened to a lot of your podcasts, and I know that you have a different life that transitioned into something. But when you look back in your life before crypto, what were the experiences that you had that made you connect instantly?
Sure, thank you. So one thing is I'm half Colombian, and I grew up mostly in Colombia. As many of you might have known, Colombia has a long and complicated history of political dysfunctions, of terrorist groups, of narco traffic, of all kind of issues related to corruption and poor governance that even today still affect the country. And so I always have had that a little bit in the background. However, my career started with something completely unrelated. And I was very interested in food and creativity. I ended up falling in love with molecular cuisine. It was, wow. I guess, there was like a second cousin that showed me this book about a famous chef in Spain who was like one of the pioneers of this movement. And I started flickering through that, and I was like just mind blown. There was stuff like he had this glass or a whiskey glass, and inside there was like a brown jelly and a pink cube and a green cube and a white crunchy thing. And supposedly you ate that and you're like, oh, first very confused. And then wait a second, this is sushi. And I'm like, what do you mean this is sushi? It's soy sauce jelly and a salmon cube and an avocado cube and the rice crunch and the crunchy thing white is actually rice cracker and so on. And so it came together. And I was like, wow, that's really creative and interesting. And I fell in love with that. And so I went into this area. I was in between law and cooking, did internships in each, ended up moving to Spain actually to join the molecular cuisine movement, or so I thought. And I was chasing this vision of these very creative, innovative spaces that were mixing technology and culture and new ideas and psychology and history. And it just seemed really exciting.
But is molecular cuisine still a massive thing even now? I still feel that it's still not as mainstream as you think. No? So from a young age itself, you were getting into pretty radical aspects itself, right?
Yeah, I always had that kind of niche interest for, I don't know, different ideas, I guess. And that was just like, it seemed like way sexier and hotter than law, at least the law as I saw it. Right now, especially in web3, there is some really amazing people doing very radical law. But at the time, it was something else. And I went chasing that. And over the next 6 years or so, I actually ended up studying cooking, and I ended up going to work in different free Michelin star restaurants that were highly ranked across the 50 best of the world. So I work in Belgium, I work in Italy, and study in France and so on. And I was just chasing that dream, mostly doing a lot of internships and so on, and trying to go and learn from these celebrities that were like creative geniuses. But every time I joined one of these places, what I would encounter was mostly an extremely hierarchical place. This is because you need so high quality in execution, like molecular cuisine in general, but molecular cuisine in particular is about very precise execution, and everything is very sensitive, and you have many different things that are being working parallel, and they need to come together, they need to be assembled just at the right time. You need to put something crunchy on top of something soft on top of something crunchy, and if that waits, it all becomes mushy, and it all becomes lukewarm instead of something hot and cold and so on. And so it's really about precision and timing, and it needs to work like clockwork. And so we had these extremely hierarchical organizations. But the issue was that the thing that was driving the people into them was the idea of creativity. Everyone wanted to learn, everyone was inspired by the ideas. However, the people at the helm of these organizations who had been very creative ones were, at least by the time I joined, by the time they were already well known and so on, they were not very creative anymore. They were a little bit stuck into a pattern, reproducing what they had done before. And when you start to know them and work with them day in and day out, I started to see that they were tremendously stressed. They had this huge pressure that the next restaurant critic was going to come in, the next season was going to come in, and they needed to have something new and exciting and creative. But if anything went wrong, the whole thing would fail and collapse. And so they were paralyzed by this fear, and they didn't really have the time or the headspace to explore new ideas. They were stuck in their style. So while before they had been very creative, now they weren't. And on the other side, you had all of these young people like myself that were working insane amount of hours for almost no money, just for the passion of it, that were full of ideas, and no one was listening for those ideas. No one cared.
Reminds me of DAO contributors in these massive DAOs in a way.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, completely. That's a very spot on analogy. And the thing is, and you know what, actually, I think it is the same thing with exactly what you're saying about these massive DAOs is sometimes the ideas of these young or less experienced people or whatever, they're just bad. But senior people also have bad ideas. That's not really the difference. For me, the main difference was that the people in a position of power, of influence, they had a lot of means at their disposal to translate from idea to practice, to experiment, to prototype, to iterate upon it, because no idea is good in the first stage. It has to go through a whole process. And so you had this huge disconnect where the young people had no means to do it, and no one was listening to their ideas and so on. So I ended up leaving that, moving to research and development, trying to find a way to learn how to do, well, have good ideas, figure out how to have good ideas, and then figure out how to develop them, how to prototype them, iterate them, and so on. And at first I did that in the food world, and then eventually I started falling out of love with the high-end food world because it just seemed like an arm race on how you could feed rich people better. And so the impact of creating the ultimate meal for some rich guy who quite often doesn't even understand food, is just that they are able to pay a lot and they want the status game, it didn't seem that meaningful. And on the other side, I was seeing this sort of social drama of these organizations where people were killing themselves, like literally like killing themselves sometimes, trying to work and outcompete the other restaurant and so on for the passion of it, but where most of that passion was actually wasted. And it was that sort of waste of human potential that for me felt like a terrible drama, and I could really identify with it. And instead of that, you had loads of office politics, loads of like bullying between people, loads of like very toxic competition and a lot of toxic environments. And all of that energy was wasted between the people as opposed to producing a great output. And so I started on a quest to figure out how to change that. And that's become my life ever since, is figuring out how can people work better together.
Very interesting, Daniel. So which was like your favorite restaurant to work in, and what was your favorite dish?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of places and they were very much opposites. So one is Le Calandre in Italy. And this was a place where it was all about the senses. And so the chef used to grab a dish and put it very close to his mouth and his face and just smell it. And so he ended up creating all of these like perfume bottles that at the table you will spray the dish with, and had, I don't know, ginger aroma and these other aromas. And he had this dish that I loved that was served in a piece of wood, a piece of bark, with raw meat chopped, some truffle, some perfect cubes of bread. Then you would have a warm napkin with star anise. And so your hands would actually smell like the star anise when you're eating the meat, and that worked really well together. It was a very cool, like to eat the raw meat with your hand is intense.
Yeah, you have a picture of that. You should share with us after you're done with the podcast, actually.
I don't know. I'll look. This has been like more than 10 years since I worked there. But yeah, maybe I can find it somewhere. That'd be
Yeah,
cool.
listeners, to stay tuned for the Twitter. We're going to be sharing this particular picture in a bit. But then it's such a fascinating journey. This is like the realistic version of Ratatouille, just that there's a lot of life in it. How did you transition to something like DAOs, man? How did your whole entry into something like blockchain and DAOs come into the scene?
Yeah, so there were two phases of transition. One first when I moved into organization design, and then from that can I ended up in DAOs was perhaps only a matter of time, but I'll explain more from the beginning. So first I joined these research and development laboratory. And when I was there, they ended up firing the previous team because turns out that they were doing something they were legally not allowed to do, and they got fired in the spot. And so I ended up being the only one left, and I was very young, but I ended up being the only one in a 1,000 people company who had any idea how the innovation department worked. And so I ended up having to onboard the new team, and that made me, in a way, de facto the leader of this team, not so much like the boss, but I was the one who would tell the team how we should be working. And so that gave me a first opportunity. Through that, I started to learn more and more about team management or innovation management, like how a team should work together to do research and development. And I fell completely in love with that. But there was all the other politics and so on in the organization. Everyone wanted to get some of our territory, some of our power, and so on, to have a say in what we were doing. And so that was very complicated. So I eventually ended up leaving, and I thought I would become an organization design consultant, and I would use the chef brand because chefs are innovative. So I can be a consultant and people are going to pay me for that. It's going to be great. And in practice, I end up a Monday morning in my bed, in my pajamas, going, so the phone is not ringing. How is it that I pay bills again if no one is calling me to consult for that? And so I end up like in a bit of a tough spot, but went to see some of the people I knew. And there was a professor that we had worked with in the research and development in experimental psychology. And he actually offered me to join his team for a year and do a sort of residency with them. This was in Oxford. And so I joined that position because I would bring a different outlook than the master's students. Coming more from a food experience design sort of perspective, it would bring a lot of cross-pollination to them. And that was the interest. And then through that, I was maybe thinking about doing an MBA. And so I got introduced to a professor in the business school. And we started having a few conversations. And he was like, so do you want to become a middle manager in a corporation? And I was like, no, I'm interested in innovation. And he's like, so an MBA is a terrible idea for you. You're just going to become like every other MBA student. So instead of that,
this is
like
one part of the story which we all empathize with now. Yeah. Now the MBA story, okay, both the two of us have gone through that. So now we are kind of getting into the same boat, pal.
Yeah, exactly. It starts to come a bit closer. Yeah. So this guy actually went and asked, and I was like, so you want to do innovation? Great. So what are your ideas about innovation? Have you got anything? Or are you just full of shit? And so I started sharing a little bit about the way restaurants were doing these. And he was like, you know what? That's actually quite interesting. Why don't you write about it? And so I went and I spent maybe a couple of weeks trying to write an article, brought it back to him. He started reading it, grabbed a red pen, and essentially crossed over the whole thing and said, you have no idea how to write, but this is really interesting. Let me teach you how to write. And so that was about
the Michelin chef's attitude there.
Exactly.
Go on.
Yeah. And so it was, I think, about 8 months that it took me to write a single article. But then through some people I had met and so on, I managed eventually to get that article published in Harvard Business Review. And so that was for me like a big break. Thanks to that, I started to get a little bit of a platform in the university. This professor then invited me to run some workshops with him for executive students who were doing major program management around like system design and about how we can bring innovation and high-level execution together, which was essentially the challenge of the Michelin star kitchens, is how can you be very innovative with every season while also delivering top quality consistently, and so on. And from that started to slowly develop a career in more towards organization design, and finally more in the management side, having a little bit of credibility. So I continued looking for that. Then I ended up stumbling upon the self-management world. And this was like holacracy, sociocracy, teal. There is like a range of movements and methodologies there that are, let's say, post-agile, of more like fringe communities that are trying more radical ways of people to work together. And I thought that was really the solution for some of the politics and a lot of the issues I had seen in the food world. But the more I learned about them, and I ended up getting certified in holacracy and so on, and I was really like head over heels into this thing. This is amazing. But after a while, I was struggling to convince other organizations to try them. It felt that it was this sort of promised land where everyone will be leading themselves and everyone would be responsible and everyone was empowered and so on. But actually getting there was really hard. And it required a lot of time and a lot of investment and a lot of resources. And most organizations, they either didn't care or didn't have the money to do it, or didn't have the technological capabilities to have any support around it. So it was all like pen and paper processes, and that made it very difficult. So from that, then I ended up discovering systems thinking and essentially went through the same process. Like, oh, wow, this is amazing. This is the solution. And then wait a second, but why has systems thinking been talked about since the 60s and 70s? And how come that all organizations are not using it? What's missing? And then realizing that it just went above the head of most people. It was just too hard to translate it, the everyday concerns that they had of how do I get more customers? And systems thinking will be like, oh, it's about open systems and you have these different fractals and blah, blah, blah. And it just wouldn't resonate with me. And it wasn't until 2018 that I started to stumble upon DAOs and that I heard about Aragon and a few of the other Colony and a few of the others who were like in that early stage starting to develop these technologies, that I was like, oh, wow, here is a space that actually has the willingness to innovate, the technological capabilities, and the capital to make it happen. And I redirected to DAOs and haven't really looked back, because it still today feels like the highest leverage opportunity to transform the way we design organizations and we humans work together.
That's super fascinating, Daniel. So I just want to understand, how was the contributor scene back in 2018 versus compared to right now?
So one of the main things for me is that the technology was so early days that it was really all infrastructure. So if you were not a developer, it was very hard to engage and to do things. And I really struggled. I almost ended up joining Consensus. I went through 4 interviews, and then that's when Consensus started retracting, like contracting after the 2018 winter kind of thing. And then, so the job didn't exist anymore. And there just wasn't a lot that one could do, because these were communities of developers exclusively. If you were not super fluent in creating GitHub issues and so on, there was no place for you. And I feel that has really changed now. Like now there is a lot more space for all kind of skill sets that are not developers to come into the mix. And part of the issue, in fact, was that because for so long you needed to be a developer, or at least that was the culture, is if you're not a developer, you have very little to contribute. That even today we are suffering sometimes from a lot of things being built, but they don't really solve anyone's problem. They're very visionary, and some of them hit goal, but the majority of them, they're just missing a little bit of user research. There are a little bit of branding, a little bit of UX, a little bit of community building, a little bit of all the other disciplines that are needed to make good products, or even a little bit of understanding of how humans work together, like group psychology, political science, organization design, simply understanding of leadership and management kind of thing. And so because of that, we end up with so many products from back then that didn't make it. And even today, a lot of that is happening, a lot of reinventing the wheel, just because there are communities that are not connecting with these other bodies of knowledge and these other disciplines that have studied these problems from a different angle.
I think a lot of the issues that happened in 2018, we even had a piece by Fred Wilson of Union Square Ventures at the time. I think the main reason was, at that time, you didn't have a lot of mature tech. People were just experimenting around with it. An emphasis on developers first was always the key there. And back then, the way developers think is you ship fast, you iterate, and accordingly, depending on how the user takes it, according to that sort of mentality, never really opened up the niche for marketeers or organizational design or any of these people that you mentioned to come in and make an impact from the early stage of the product itself. However, the more the product matured and people started to understand that these sort of departments were necessary, then you've started to see a lot of impact from all these marketeers and organizational design people from day one. I think it's that a whole ship fast and iterate thing that's plagued a lot of these products. And in that aspect, the sort of work that is doing is kind of a good thing, because you give a lot of body of work for a developer to build something radical that way, rather than just build something and see how it clicks. and fail really hard at that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that very much resonates. And I think it's a lesson that we have learned as a society, like in general, the hard way. Even in traditional startups, like even in Web2, the role of operations is relatively new. For a long time, it was only either you were a developer or you were a designer or you were a founder, which meant you were raising investment. And that was about it. Only then people started to realize it's more complex than that. And if you actually want a product to succeed in a market where many other people are doing solutions, you really need to understand what you're doing and you need to bring these different expertise. And now we have deep tech where we have like scientists working together with product teams and so on. And so for RnDAO, what we were seeing was a lot of people from Web2 coming into Web3. This was in the previous bull market. So all of these people were coming in. They wanted to start something. And quite often they would see, for example, I don't know, at the time I was in Aragon. So they would see the Aragon product and they would be like, oh, okay, this is a thing, it works, but it's not perfect. And it has all of these flaws. So I think I can do better. So they would go and start something that was fairly similar. And then they would run into the same issues of struggling to attract enough developers, struggling to attract enough designers, and then fundamentally just create something that was a slightly different iteration. And then that became like mediocre product number 3. And then a third person would come in and see that and be like, oh, these 2 products are not great, I can do it better. And then they would start the third one, and quite often they would run into the same issue. And so it was like this growing fragmentation where every person, like there wasn't a single player who was able to get all the talent, all the funding, and all the brand and attention and like everything together to make it work. And it was just more and more people dividing the same resources. And that was one big problem we were seeing. The other big problem was that a lot of these new people coming and wanting to start organizations, and there was so much VC funding going around. That's probably about to happen very soon again, because VCs have something like 280 billion waiting to be deployed. So it's a crazy amount of money. So it will probably happen again. But the problem is there comes all of these people who don't really understand what they're solving for. They haven't spent a lot of time in Web3. They don't really know what DAOs are about. They go, oh, it turns out that DAOs are not very good at project management. So what project management tools are there? Oh, Trello. Great, let me create a copy of Trello that is Web3. Or, oh, Discord. Oh, we need a Discord that is more Web3. So they speak with people and people complain it's not decentralized. And they go, okay, great. Let me add let me say that we're going to progressively decentralize and then just copy Discord. And that doesn't really work because there is not a 10x factor. It's not innovative enough to justify people migrating. Or if it works, it still doesn't really improve society. We end up just copying Web2 into Web3. And these stories around progressive decentralization, many times they never materialize because people build a centralized organization in the meantime.
Yeah, this just goes on to say that there is a concept that is coined by Naval Ravikant and Chris Dixon, saying skeuomorphic design. That is the designs that are Web3 native rather than just applying those same layers on existing Web2 systems. So that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is kind of when we study innovators, like the people who are really innovative, who really manage to create something new that has tremendous value for society and for themselves and so on, they're usually thinking about first principles. And the issue with first principles is that getting to first principles requires a lot of thinking and a lot of hard work to distill those first principles. And so if you're able to raise 3, 4, 5 million from a PowerPoint before you understand the problem, it's so easy to just start building and throwing resources at the problem without knowing what problem you're actually solving for, without spending the time to learn those principles. Because actually having more people and more funding and so on makes it even harder to do that. Counterintuitively, because you need the calmness, you need to be able to have deep work sessions, you need to have that mental space to go and inquire and think about and read a lot and speak with people without trying to rush to what's your problem, I'm going to give you a solution tomorrow. You actually just need to go and really get to understand them and speak with them again. And it's only by the 4th, 5th time that you speak with someone that you really need to start to go below the surface. Before that, they don't trust you enough. They're just going to give you like pain points, but pain points is not the same as needs. And we need to understand both.
So you've had all these, what to say, you've had all these sort of first principles that guided you for strong innovation, and you were working with Aragon, who really came to the scene the first time since I remember 2017. They came with this DAO framework, and they should have had this first mover advantage. But my question is, you had the opportunity to work with a couple of these organizations that wanted to DAOify, and now you see a massive boom of these DAOs coming into the scene. What are the first principles that you learned that makes it necessary for a DAO to stay true to the roots of what you call a DAO? And I've sensed that dissonance is what made you want to move over and start RnDAO itself, because a lot of that fundamentals were just missing. So what were those fundamentals, and how did that kind of transform to you wanting to start your own organization out of it?
So I guess for me, what DAO means is an ideal, is these set of values that we're hoping to work towards. And in very layman terms, we're talking, we want people to be empowered. We want, for me very personally, I want everyone who joins this organization to be able to contribute their best ideas and to be able to take them further. And if they really believe about it, to be able to try them out and experiment and refine them and have the support from the organization so they can translate them into something actually good. So it's not only the people at the center that have a very limited view, the only ones who are able to do that. It's kind of like making the organization into an innovation platform is a lot of what motivates me. But there is other ways to frame it. Like I really like the way Spencer from DAO House frames it around anti-capture, of how the issue we have in a lot of developing countries, in a lot of corporations and so on, is that a small group of people have captured this organization that is meant to serve everyone involved. And they have captured it and they extract the maximum benefit and everyone else gets screwed. And so this idea that we can grow the pie together rather than fighting for who gets the bigger slice is for me a little bit the holy grail of what we're aiming for. And if we can actually create these organizations, we make society better and we'll be part of communities where everyone is happier and healthier. And at the end, what makes us happier is not more money. Like countless research has shown that increasing wealth at the end only leads to being miserable. And we still need a good amount of wealth and to be prosperous and so on. But what really makes us happy, what at the end ends up being a lot more important, ends up having to do with also the people around us being well and so on. And so we want to create these organizations where that is possible and where also we can deal with some of the big challenges like climate change and so on, instead of just burning ourselves inside this planet that is heating. Like it's just, let's stop that thing. And a lot of what I wasn't seeing in the organizations was that we're starting to assume that the current shape of DAOs is the final shape of DAO. So people were like, oh, a DAO is direct democracy, meaning token holders vote. And I'm like, that's not necessarily the best way to get there. That was the first way, but there is so many different ways we can design it and so many other processes and ways to think about it, that it was more that deeper reflection about how humans should work together and not only what's technologically possible, which is a whole other challenge. But we need to have both conversations at the same time of what's technologically possible and what's actually a good way for humans to collaborate and work together. And if we could create better answers for each of those, then we could create better DAOs. That's like thinking of the DAO as something that will be maybe forever working on, but or at least something that we're trying to create in 5-8 years from now and not tomorrow. And there is many small pieces of that puzzle that we need to think about and work through. And the first principle for me is let's bring different people together from different disciplines. Let's bring a lot of the learnings that we have had in the past from all of the things that have been researched and studied and experimented with. And let's start from that basis, trying to distill all of these into first principles for each of the areas that is going to be a lot more likely to get us to better organizations that actually serve everyone, where we are happy and also where we're going to make a decent living and be prosperous ourselves while doing so, rather than just brute forcing, repeating the same stuff or trying to reinvent the wheel without learning from the past.
So that was the whole idea for RnDAO in general, or was that the whole experience and made you feel like, okay, this is why you need a DAO for that?
I was starting to do that within Aragon. When I was there, I was trying to bring this team together. The thing that made me leave Aragon was partially the culture was becoming very competitive. It was a lot, the competition is doing this and so on, and very stressed out. And there were some methodologies that had been implemented that I strongly disagree with, like OKRs, that I thought were really not helping what we were trying to do, at least at the time. And then there was also some toxicity in the culture, like the politics, backstabbing, back-channeling, all of those kind of things. And I felt that we needed to be able to create a healthier space, a safer space for people to be more vulnerable, for all of us to accept that we don't have the final answer, for us to not be fighting for our territory, like the marketing guys, like I do the marketing, I do community, the partnerships guys, like, oh, I do this stuff, the governance guy, oh, I do this stuff. That wasn't really conducive, I felt, to what we were trying to do. We needed more trust between us to create that sort of incubation created space for it. So I end up leaving and trying to set it up more as an inter-DAO initiative where we could collaborate with many other different DAOs and many different partners to bring the different projects to light.
Yeah. So when you're like starting out, it's almost as can be compared like doing a startup. You need a lot more generalists rather than specialists. So that attitude of having generalists, everybody doing everything, that kind of helps. So that you might say was missing probably there.
Yeah. It was like, both the communication at the end is about the mindset and of let's really come together and have some conversations. And in Aragon, I always felt like we're struggling to have enough time to align. And because we couldn't align, then we were going in many different directions at the same time, and that wasn't really working. Also, because the organization was still run not really as a DAO. DAO, when you're trying to run in different directions, you can create space and new people can come in because the organization is open. Like we had these constant feed of inbound of people going, hey, I want to work in DAOs. I want to do something. And we had no way to communicate with them. These are things that are needed, or come have a conversation with us. We'll see what you can do and we'll see what some ideas I have. And I'm going to give you some context so you can actually work on something meaningful. And there was that big disconnect. So in a way, that was part of what was attempted with launching the DAO for them. But then I ended up living in the Aragon by the early stage of that process. And then there were some other conflicts with the team and other people who left shortly after. So a lot of it was a cultural breakdown, let's say.
I see this pattern, where be it with your journey with the whole molecular cuisine or the sort of work that you did with organizational design and now Aragon, a fundamental issue with all these experiences were that organization had some sort of cultural issue and a human factor that kind of impacted innovation. And that is the central theme that made you want to step out and try out something new always. And this kind of repeats with Aragon also. So now you've taken the lessons of all these things and now you've decided that you wanted to facilitate the whole collective of this whole RN. What is the vision that drives RnDAO initially, and what are the sort of people that you would want to have be a part of this collective, and how would you do things differently? How would you like to see things do differently with RnDAO?
Yeah, so first, the hardest part and the hardest thing is to move to an understanding that all of us have traumas, all of us have character issues, all of us have insecurities, and all of us under certain circumstances, we're going to get triggered and start acting a little bit irrational and defensive and so on. And having an organization that can understand that and be able to deal with conflict productively, as opposed to either when there is a conflict, one of the two people is wrong and they must be expelled or punished. But instead of that, understanding that every conflict is an opportunity for growth, an opportunity for learning, an opportunity for development, and that all of us are imperfect and have issues to work with. And for the organization to purposely take into account that the individuals need to develop themselves. We're not only doing organization development or product development, we also need to do human development. So that's the hardest bit, and that's the bit even in RnDAO, we still struggle with it because it's not something that we usually think about in business. And at the same time, if that's all we do and we become too radical about that, we stop running the business. We stop making the organization sustainable. So there is a tension there that needs to be managed very carefully, and it's not easy. So I'm interested in people who are willing to do that hard work, who are not going to be, oh, I only want to care about the individuals, or I want to be super woke and do something where everyone is let's be inclusive, and then everyone needs to be included, and end up being so extreme, let's say on inclusivity or on diversity or on the way we talk with each other or whatever it is, right? There is all of these things that are great, but if we become too extreme, the business is almost impossible to sustain, and it becomes more a very small radical organization that is more of a pet project. And those are needed, and we need those to inspire the rest of us, but that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do, at least for me, is something that is a little bit more balanced in between being a sustainable, viable, successful organization that is also aspiring to constantly become better in that dimension. So being able to keep that balance, that's one of the things I really think about, and it's really hard to do, but really important and really valuable to look after. Then in terms of the vision for RnDAO itself, part of the issue with a lot of the big DAOs and the ones that have gotten big treasuries is that even if the funds are distributed through community voting, it's still a sort of top-down mechanism. There is like one instance and the money comes from that. So you're either going to try to convince a CEO, or you're going to try to convince a committee of delegates, or you're going to go and try to convince the community. And all of that is inward looking. To get funds for your team, you need to convince people inside the organization that's the right thing to do, instead of convincing the people who benefit from your work. So we're trying to do more of a platform model where there is a minimal infrastructure that is RnDAO, a shared brand. We share networks, we share introductions and so on. We have a shared resources. People come into RnDAO and we try to collaborate as much as possible. But then we have a range of units within RnDAO. Anyone can start a new unit. But the idea is that most of the funding for these units need to come either from the outside, from clients or the ecosystem that are going to pay us to do something, or from other units that are going to pay this unit to do something that they need. And that way, instead of coordinating how we allocate resources top down through a single mechanism, and because in a single mechanism, let's say it's community voting. So then you ask everyone in the community, should the HR team or the marketing team get more money? Or should the product team or this other team that is creating some documentation? Most of the community doesn't know because they're not involving those two teams. So how are they going to be able to make a decision of which team is producing more value and so on? So that's why we flip it on its head. And if the HR team, and I'm using HR as just as a well-known example, we actually don't have an HR team, but we very much could. But let's say there is an HR team and they want to get more funding to do more recruitment because they realize that we need a better talent pipeline, and we need to attract more developers or designers or, I don't know, social scientists, whatever it is. So they go to one of the product teams and they go, give us some of your budget and we'll bring you these people that you need to hire. So you create this sort of internal marketplace where you have the closest distance to customers as possible, because almost everyone is a customer to someone else. And then we create an incentive design where everyone wins by the collective winning, but you also win more by advancing your team. So people have an interest to vote with their feet and join teams or units or start units that are going to have a good opportunity. And then they have an interest to support other units with products and services, and also a little bit for the goodwill, because if the other units do well, you're also going to do well. So it's about balancing kind of like those two incentives, but creating as much as possible peer-to-peer regulation, but through feedback, through sharing insights, through sharing funds, through distributing funds that way, that we believe can create a more scalable DAO that is also more focused on delivering value rather than on becoming really good at internal politics and convincing everyone that your unit should get a bigger budget.
So this is the underlying way in which you would like RnDAO to actually run. But for people, this is the ideal way in which the RnDAO should be running. How exactly what are the initiatives that you would like R&D to go through? Is it something that's set from the beginning, or is this something that makes it happen on the go? What are your thoughts on that?
First, this is my opinion. Other people in RnDAO might have their own vision, and we very much encourage people having their own ideas, and we'll discuss it and debate it, and we'll have a good big argument about it, and then hopefully we manage to agree on something on the other end and have a better vision. What I'm suggesting are my ideas. Other people in RnDAO will have their own. And we are currently running somewhat like these. Like, we have the basic platform. We divide our work in two areas, what we call project units, that are more external facing. So they are research initiatives. For example, a client come to us and they ask, can you do some research on sub-DAOs? Like Subble, we recently partnered with them and run a research sprint, then did a strategy workshop with their team, with the researchers and their product team, together help them figure out their strategy. Great. That was one project unit. We have another project unit that's figuring out community health. That's a project about how do we measure health in communities, or like how do we know whether a community will stay together when there is a shock or they will fall apart, and so on. And like that, we have a series of project units that start as research initiatives and maybe over time become products if there is an opportunity. If not, they get reabsorbed and a new research initiative starts. And then we have the DAO work units, where we're doing supporting work for the rest of it, like figuring out what's the organization design. Are there some specific areas where we're gonna try to focus and this is not like a top-down set strategy, it's more we try to agree what's important, and then everyone decides what they work on. Is okay, we all said that this was important, so you would hope that people go, I think this is the most important, I'll dedicate some time to it. But it's very bottom-up coordination. And it's still, to a good part, a work in progress. The part of what we're trying to experiment at the moment is, on one side, how do we attract more people who have a problem, let's say rewards and compensation. I don't know how to do it. And many people go and do a research initiative in their own DAO, but they do it with limited resources, with a limited team to be able to do it well. And they quite often just kind of look around what other DAOs are doing and copy that, which sometimes is good. Most often than not, is going to be like minimum viable or just about functional, but largely dysfunctional. I think
that's a failure for a lot of DAOs, actually, because you're absolutely right. And while I was at Parcel, we would see all these DAOs trying to figure out a perfect compensation model for their contributors. And what they would do is rely on the existing content out there. DAO Masters, there's some piece about Coordinape, then you would see some other proposals. But then if you take a look at what's going on in all those DAOs that kind of came out with the contribution model, their contributors are not happy.
Yeah.
And it's on the basis of that content that you're actively going out and building your own compensation model, because you think in your head that these are the best people to come out with the content, and relatively low content also, that too. There's not been a lot of validation about whether the contributors are happy. Is compensation actively given out to the people that's contributed accordingly? None of these discussions have not really happened, and it's really heartening to see the sort of work that's come from the R&D. This thing you mentioned, that you're building a guidebook for best practices for rewards and compensation. What I know that it's still a work in progress, but what are the learnings that you've found that other DAOs are just not doing, or there must be something that you must have encountered while dealing with that particular thing?
So there is some preliminary work that we have done on these. One is the understanding of the difference in between what's a task-based culture and a relationship-based culture. So Anglo-Saxon culture, usually people assess each other's, whether they want to work with you, whether you are good at executing a task. And other cultures, more like Middle Eastern cultures, certain Asian cultures like Japanese or Chinese, or even Latin American cultures, they're a lot more relationship-based, in that we trust more the relationship that we have with someone. And because so much of the DAO tooling and DAO methodology has been designed by Anglo-Saxon cultures, there is somewhat this extreme bias. Also because there was a lack of trust, like anons or people who are pseudonymous and so on. So people try to bring contracting to the most basic, which is a bounty, is give me the work done, the proof that you have done it, and then I'm going to pay you for that. But I'm not going to support you in any way, or we don't have any other contractual relationship, or otherwise pretty much any other relationship other than that microtransaction. And that in some situations work. It's good to attract contributors at the beginning to a DAO, but after that, it requires a tremendous amount of overhead. Like creating bounties requires a lot of work from the bounty creator to break down the work, to bound it, to scope it, to define how much the reward is, and so on. And equally for the person executing the bounties, it doesn't allow for a lot of autonomy. It's a fairly disempowered position. So if we keep on running organizations mainly with bounties or other with bounties, we end up in this extreme task-based culture that is actually not very productive and doesn't offer a lot of safety. And if you're coming from a very privileged position where you have a full-time job and that pays you well, and you're just looking for a hobby on the side and you contribute to a DAO and do a couple of things, that makes sense. But if you actually need a full-time job, if you need a way to pay rent and so on, and maybe this month there is a bounty, but if next month there is not a bounty, what are you going to do? So DAOs lose a lot of talent by not offering something that provides a little bit more of a safety net and reliability. So one idea we had developed was this concept of minimum viable salaries, which is as long as you have a minimum level of engagement and contribution for the next 3 months, you have a sort of UBI salary guaranteed. If after 3 months you haven't continued contributing, it stops. But so this is a way to value the relationship. And it's not because you have completed the task, it's because you have invested a lot of time to learn about the DAO, to gain all of that context and all of that knowledge and build the relationships with all the other people that you need to be able to actually deliver high output, high quality work. Because it's not just about having a composable skill. It's not just about being good at design or writing or marketing or whatever it is. It's actually all the specific learning that you need to do about that local context that is essential for you to do good, next level work, especially when it starts to be strategy and other things which are more subjective. And so that was one idea, is valuing that. On top is essentially combining. The other piece of big learning that we have had is that when you run you need to adjust the cycles at which you reward and appraise the work to the sort of work that you are rewarding. Some sort of work is very operational. Let's say if you're a waiter in a restaurant, did you deliver the food to the table? Yes, no. You know immediately whether someone is doing a good job or not. But if you're doing a management executive sort of job, or if in a DAO, if you're trying to figure out, let's figure out the vision for this DAO and everyone who's contributing to this vision work, do you know if that's going to be a good vision or not? It's probably going to take you like 2 years to figure out whether that vision was good or bad. And so you cannot fully reward that with a bounty. You need to adjust for that. So at the beginning, we were using, for example, coordinate circles in 2-week epochs. And that was very good to reward inputs, to reward effort, but it was really bad at rewarding outputs. So we had some people who joined who were very motivated. They had a lot of skill, an amazing background. They tell us, oh, I did this in the past, and we're like, wow, you're amazing. But then they actually didn't deliver anything because they were just more there for the curiosity. They got involved in everything and in nothing, and they didn't deliver any value. And we had already rewarded them a fair bit for small things they started doing, but then they drop off. And so instead of that, we move it to quarterly appraisal cycles. So we are purposely rewarding more outputs, which has other downsides. Like some in the short term, people don't know if they're doing well or bad, or if they're going to be rewarded and so on. So we had to create other systems to compensate that. But at least in our situation, moving to quarterly cycles of peer-to-peer accounting of contributions made a lot more sense and shifted a lot more to appraising outputs and actual value delivered, as opposed to effort or things like that.
So the way I see it, you had the system that now actually promotes outputs, but the entire duration was so long that that's at least in the minds that needs more. It's just that duration that's the issue, right? That the contributor doesn't know whether he's in a position to do better or not, because it's like a massive quarter ahead. So with that regard, I just wanted to understand, what is the roadmap ahead? Now you have these sort of internal processes. What is the roadmap ahead for RnDAO? And how exactly do you expect people to contribute down the line?
Yeah, sure. So we're starting these different research units. At the moment, we have a few. Anyone who wants, they can join RnDAO, the platform. They can then join these different units. if you're in an organization and you have a specific problem, let's say like rewards and compensation or community health or whatever, come and speak with us, and we can probably partner and do a research initiative together with you to advance that agenda and give you a solution that's going to be better. And we can probably help to facilitate a coalition with multiple DAOs to fund that research and make sure that it works really well. Then if you're a sort of entrepreneur that's coming into the space, you want to lead something, before you go and start building the next thing that you think is great, we have done a lot of research trying to figure out what are the top problems in DAOs. Come join RnDAO, partner with us. Together, we're going to research that problem, make sure you have a really good understanding of the problem before you go and start building the next thing. And that way, we hopefully create a more meaningful startup. So in a way, RnDAO works as an incubation space for research projects and for DAO tooling products. And in that, one thing that we're experimenting with is the idea of inventing the hackathon. So instead of it being, let's just build, because the issue is a lot of those teams don't survive. They build a lot of things that are not needed, or the teams don't gel, they don't stay, because people have fallen in love with a solution, but they haven't fallen in love with the problem. And solving a problem requires first really understanding it and then iterating through multiple solutions. If you fall in love with one solution, most likely is the wrong idea. It's just the first idea. So we're trying to change the hackathon a little bit, maybe make it into a research-a-thon or something like that, where teams would actually start by first going very deep, understanding the first principles about the problem, how does that thing work, and only then start working. And so we might be creating some sort of cohort framework around these, partnering with different DAOs around the research problems that they have. And hopefully with these, create a new generation of DAO tooling products or of startups, of Web3, of DAOs themselves that can be a little bit more impactful than what we usually see coming out of a hackathon. And so if you're interested in either contributing to create this program or participate in some of the research initiatives or in developing some of the products, we have space for all the usual roles. We need designers, we need backend engineers, we need marketeers, we need community managers. We need especially a lot of smart researchers and people who are interested in distilling things to first principles.
I find the sort of work that you're all doing pretty fascinating that way, and a really amazing conversation, Daniel. I see that there's a lot of idealism packed with a lot of experience that kind of makes R&D a really potential organization that will really do well in the future. For two call to actions here. How can contributors come and participate in the vision of R&D, and how can potential partners reach out to you to boost their own initiatives when it comes to the client-led research and things like that?
Yeah, so for RnDAO, the easiest thing is just follow us on Twitter. That's at RnDAO_ or at RnDAO, and send us a message. If you want to join as a contributor, in the bio you'll find the link. Just start joining. It will take you through the process. Most likely you will speak with me on the other end. Once you join the DAO, just say hello in introductions, and I'll be happy to welcome you personally into the community. Equally, for anyone sort of interested in partnering with us, you can as well use the same contact or at rndao.info as well. At the bottom there is a page there, and at the bottom of that page, you can find our contact information or simply send us a DM on Twitter. And at the same way, you can message me directly. My DMs are open. It's at _Daniel _Ospina, that's Ospina. And yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to have conversations with new people who are interested in this space and figure out how together we can create better ways for humans to work together.
This is fantastic, Daniel. This conversation was so much full of ideas, but not just ideas. They were like really backed up with like tactical advices. So that's something very rare to come across. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
That's about it from our end. Thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you for stepping forward and being a part of a growing community. And stay tuned. Follow us on Twitter. We are also available on other major streaming platforms. Thank you. Bye-bye.